I hear that and some questions come to my mind. I think the first thing that the city needs, I don't talk about this on the show a lot, but I think it's time to talk about it. I believe strongly in this, but maybe others don't. Let's start looking at the evidence. I'm going to get right to it today. No rant, no nothing. Let's talk about the issues. I have David Ryder from the Toronto Star, who many of you know from his writing, his tweeting. He's followed the election very closely over the last year, including council races very closely. And as many of you who have listened to this show since we started it 10 weeks ago know, I spent as much time talking about council races and the incumbency issues and incumbency advantages, and we'll have a chat about that, David. And we're also joined by the great Ben Spurr from Now Magazine. Everybody knows Ben, active tweeter, active at City Hall, always around in the scrums. And so it's great to have you guys here, and I'm looking forward to, as I said before we went live, shooting the blank, but we'll call it shooting the breeze. And that's what we're going to do today here on The Truth with Ari Goldkind. So, gentlemen, the election is over. It's a new day. It's a new dawn. I'm trying to think of about 10 other cliches. I've seen all the pictures of Mr. Tory coming out of City Hall, and on that first day I saw him coming out with a binder. And I love that picture because it actually showed here's a person who's going to start doing some homework. And I thought that was a very, very significant optical change from, the previous administration of do nothing, read nothing, be part of nothing. So, Ben, let's start with you first. I take it, I'm hoping you took a couple days off to decompress.
Yeah.
And David, I'm hoping you did the same too.
A little bit, yeah. I was, I'm getting a day off Friday.
All right. So and for me, it's funny. I was joking with you guys. I've been as busy, if not busier now, with all the things post-election than I was before. So I don't know when I'm going to breathe. But Ben, let's start with you. Have you noticed any significant changes in the culture, the air, the atmosphere at City Hall, or is it too soon to mention?
No, I think there has been. I should say I haven't spent as much time at City Hall since the election, just because there isn't as much going on there. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there had to be a change. I don't think anyone was going to carry on like the Ford administration, and it seems like Tory's doing a pretty good job right now of just kind of steadying the ship, enjoying the kind of post-election honeymoon period and
euphoria.
Yeah, and just going in and I think he's been pretty non-committal about a lot of things, not trying to rock the boat. Like yesterday on Monday there was a big TTC report from the TTC union, and he just says, hey, it's constructive and let's talk about it kind of thing, but doesn't necessarily say I like this, I don't like that. It's just all let's talk and get things.
That seems to be a theme that I think continues from the election. I mean, he was very, very smart, and I read a lot of pieces that break down. And David, perhaps you can comment on this about the Nick Kouvalis approach. One issue. Stick to that issue. Don't get involved with controversial positions on the others. So like Ben, you were just saying, he says, let's talk about it. Let's wait for a report.
Mm-hmm.
And that is his approach. And obviously, hundreds of thousands of people support that, and that's good. David, is that something that you're noticing, that sort of non-committal, don't get your hands too dirty?
Yeah. And I mean, John Tory is not the mayor yet. So everything right now is prep, right? And he's the mayor-elect. And in December, he actually takes the reins of government. But yeah, I mean, I've been in and out as well. I've been at City Hall every day. It definitely is a very different vibe. One of the stories is that, Doug Ford, the way we'd always scrum Doug Ford about different things, and how could you not? Well, one of the reasons we see him so much is, I don't know if you remember the story, Ari, that when he first came to City Hall, he has a very tall Lincoln SUV.
Yes.
And he tried to park it in the underground parking lot, and he scraped the roof. His SUV was too tall for the City Hall underground councilor's parking lot. As a result, he had to park in an outside lot that happened to be right across from the media gallery. So our window and some of the other windows would look out. So we'd see Doug Ford walk in, and immediately you go, oh, let's go ask Doug something. And I think, the press secretary upstairs would be like, oh, no, what now? Whereas now, like, Doug's not around. Like, I just found there's just a general – there isn't that kind of feeling like we're going to have to jump to it, like a fire hall, right? Like waiting for the ding, ding, ding. It was just like, oh, stuff is happening. John Tory is talking about policy, and we're going to try and work together. So I think, there and certainly this time in 2010 everybody was just kind of reeling from the fact that a guy got elected. A lot of people thought never could get elected.
Right.
And then there was all the jockeying and who's going to line up behind this guy. I mean, I think there still is that kind of stuff going on, but walking into City Hall, you don't see it. And I did a story recently about Nick Kouvalis and his role in the election. So for those who don't follow stuff that well, so Nick is co-owns a polling and research company. He's a political strategist, a conservative political strategist, and is kind of an amazing guy in that he is a guy who really helped Rob Ford get elected. He was the brains of Rob Ford's 2010 campaign and kept John Tory out of that campaign with some people would say dirty tricks, some people would just say smart tactics to not run. This time around, he kept Doug Ford out of office by helping John Tory get elected. Right. So Nick is a little bit of a divisive figure at City Hall. Some of the councillors, especially on the left side of the spectrum, found him a bit of a threatening figure or kind of a dark lord. I remember one of them saying to me once,
"Sounds like a compliment to me."
Well, he would take it. I mean, some would. I mean, he would say, "I'm good at my job."
Right.
I remember one of them saying to me early in the 2010, I guess early in 2011, saying, "He even looks like Lucifer." I remember saying, "Well, you can't. He's got a dark goatee. You can't give him that." But but he now very much has John Tory's ear in the same way that he had Rob Ford's ear. And I know that there's some people for that story. I reached out to some people who I knew were not big fans of his, who didn't want to talk to me. And they were saying, I guess, two things. One, I want to start off on a good foot. I don't want to criticize the new mayor's one of his advisors.
Right.
But I think underneath there was a fear of, I might want to be on a committee, and if I start talking about against the guy who has, so there's stuff going on at City Hall, but it already, but it definitely isn't the kind of like a fire hall kind of anything could happen feeling from before.
So let me ask you about this, and Ben, I say this with a smile. I mean, I've had really, really great journalists and guests on. Matt Elliott was on last week, John Lawrence the week before, great people, and there's a part of me that almost feels bad for you guys that you don't have the Ford Circus for the next 4 years. I mean, you may have it come Ward 2 and all of that, and that will attract a circus. But in a way, is it a letdown that you may now not have an insane asylum to cover?
I mean, it's certainly true that those stories about Ford, always got a lot of readers and everything, and so from that standpoint, it was often very easy. All you had to do was show up to a scrum with Doug Ford and hope that he said something kind of strange, and he probably would, and it'd be easy to write a story. But I don't there is this kind of idea that journalists will miss the Fords. Like all that stuff really detracted from a lot of things that I think journalists like to do, which is get deeper into issues and that kind of thing, and just like. I like sitting down and reading budget reports sometimes and stuff, and finding out things that do really matter and everything. So, I mean, I think it certainly will take some attention away from City Hall, probably, which is too bad. I think that even without Rob Ford, there are people who should be paying attention to what goes on at City Hall. But I don't know. And also it's just kind of stressful. Like my colleague Jonathan Goldsby, he talks about how during the Ford era, he'd be scared to go to a movie because he'd come out of he didn't want to not be checking his Twitter. Right. He'd come out and
and that guy's on Twitter a lot.
Yeah, and he'd come out and be like, "Oh, Rob Ford's in rehab now." You were just always afraid that you were going to miss some massive development.
And that's kind of what I mean. Is there's this sense that as much as I could even see it from the outside, that the circus was in town. And you talked about this. So David, you work for the Star. So
yes.
let me tie this into how it affects both of you, because you said what people want to read.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about this in the past, and I think it's one of the biggest issues that we have to talk about as a city, province, government, which is the Star has a paywall.
It's coming down.
And it's coming down.
Yes.
But there's a lesson from that paywall. I know it's coming down because ad revenue and all that. I read the story about it. But, what does it say? And, this is for both of you guys, where if you had a story where Doug Ford scraped the top of his Lincoln in the parking garage and then went out and, I guess blamed the Jews because his wife is part Judish, that would have attracted 6,000 clicks on a paywall. Ben, if you write a story, and we're going to get to the police budget in a few minutes, if you write a story on the police budget, and that, or you do, David, because you have the paywall now you don't, that might get about 147 hits. How do you counter that as journalists in a declining market for journalists, where your friends and coworkers obviously worry about losing their job? How do you do the journalistic work that you want to do in that climate?
I don't think you do counter it. I won't speak for Ben, but I'd say, we are basically, there's a lot of things to parse from the Ford era, and one of them is the role of the media and politicians. The Fords were very good at framing it as a fight between the Star and the Mayor Ford and his administration. We never saw it that way. We always said we're covering a mayor who's doing more things that a mayor normally wouldn't do, and therefore we're writing more stories. And yes, we're being tough and aggressive, but we were tough and aggressive with David Miller. And if you look at Royce and James' columns about David Miller the last year of his term especially, this was not like a love-in that some people like to portray it. So I think we didn't kind of change the way we did anything. It was how it was being framed, and then the relationship where the Star wasn't getting press releases and was getting a combative, which had ripple effects. It had an effect on our relationship with other media, which is always competitive, but usually kind of a friendly competitive. But suddenly we were having to rely on competitors to let us know when the mayor was going to be somewhere. So it was all kind of weird and strange. But at the end of the day, I guess the underlying question is the legacy of the Ford era. And I think you could say that, yes, scraping a top of a truck, or the mayor, if you remember when it was a scandal that the mayor was reading while driving, which now seems kind of quaint.
I wish there was more of that for 3 years.
But that got big headlines. But I would say, if you look at step back from the Ford legacy, you can argue nobody did more for civic engagement than Rob Ford.
Right.
He made, by threatening city services, he made people care about and love city services. By threatening the waterfront, Doug Ford made people get engaged. So the Toronto Star, yes, had lots of the silly, kind of crazy stories. We also had a story about a 14-year-old girl going to speak to executive committee at 2 a.m. and crying her eyes out, talking about how much she loves her public library.
That's right.
We also did, and Ben and others did, lots of good, in-depth journalism on all kinds of things. Now, you may argue people didn't maybe look at it, but I'd argue that we had a well-informed citizenry because we had an active media, and if there was some stuff that was circus-like, it's what's happening, he's the mayor.
Right.
But there was the other stuff, too. If it was only the scraping the top of the truck, then I'd have a problem.
And you wouldn't have gotten, your point is a very, very wise point. We wouldn't have gotten to a 60% or so voter turnout if we were just discussing whether we want to privatize garbage east of Yonge.
No.
So your point is very well taken. Now, Ben, I've got you here, and I'm going to ask you a question, and I think, David, you'll like this question too, because, some people know what I think when I don't censor myself. So you work for Now Magazine, and, if this is a question that you can answer, great, and if you can't, you can tell me where to go.
Okay.
Right? No, but I'm flagging it because it's something that I've talked a lot about with a lot of people. Last week I went for lunch with a very, very well-known person who is very instrumental on the quote-unquote left, very huge supporter of Olivia Chow, but very, very disappointed in that campaign. So this is a question for you because you know that no matter what, I think issues matter, and it's the issues that affect people's lives on a daily basis, not the circus. So Now Magazine and your editor wrote a pretty scathing open letter to Olivia Chow maybe a month before the election, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was scathing. And to me, it was dead on every point, and it was things that I was talked off the ledge when I was debating. You can't go after Olivia for 3 reasons, and, people can figure out what those are. But it was scathing, and it was really on about, look, if you're going to be progressive, it doesn't mean having the same tax policy as the other two. If you're going to talk about issues, where's the money going to come from? Why are you moving right in the city? Okay? It was scathing. And then about 2-3 weeks later, on the eve of the election, without any change in policy on her behalf, without any move leftward, without anything other than maybe another let's love the children routine, the paper issues a glowing endorsement of Ms. Chow's candidacy. And this is something that's come up in a lot of conversations that I've had. Is that something that you noticed in your paper? Is that something that, you had an opinion on? Or was that just literally, the editor-in-chief says, can't vote for Ford, can't vote for Tory, so we're going to write a glowing endorsement of the person we literally just scathingly criticized 2 weeks before? Did that lead to any conversation in and amongst your colleagues, your friends, your papers? That's something you noticed, David, Ben first, but I noticed it as a reader.
Yeah, I think you could still say that Olivia's policies were much more aligned with the editorial values of Now magazine than Tory and then Doug Ford, of course. And I think she did. I don't know. I think she did make some more gestures towards what you would call her progressive base. I think that she was the only one really talking about things like she had a concrete plan for affordable housing. She was talking about like pedestrian safety, active transportation, things that other candidates weren't talking about at all, childcare and things like that. So I think she was still aligned with a lot of the progressive values in some ways, and it wasn't not a surprise to me at all that Now endorsed her.
Yeah, not a surprise.
No, not a surprise. But I think
you get the gist of my question. There wasn't some massive thing where she came out and said,
But I mean, I think that compared to. If your question is why didn't they endorse you, I mean that's
a different question, which we're not going to do. Because I'm not high enough on the totem pole.
Because
I can answer that one
from the other two candidates, right. Other two major candidates. I think that Now it was quite a clear choice for a paper with those kind of values. I think there was a larger question to analyze. Her campaign, which is very interesting. I think. A lot of people in the wake of that of her defeat, she came in third. She came in behind Doug Ford in a city that is, a lot of people consider it a progressive, left-wing city. What does it mean when two conservative candidates, really beat her handily? So I think that's something I hope to write about actually in the next little while, and it's a real question.
David, you want to comment, because then we're going to go right to and if Ben's writing about this, I won't give a sneak preview. But that was my follow-up question, which is
reporters like Ben and I, and you're kind of in the trenches writing, and what editors in chief are thinking or talking about, we're not usually privy to, and you kind of often I would see a certain editorial on a certain thing like at the exact same time as everybody else. I didn't know we were going to endorse this candidate or that candidate. I covered a lot of ward races, and the guy who writes the editorials for those, he sent them to me really just, I think, mostly out of fact checking. And there were some things I was like, I probably wouldn't have thought we'd go for that person, but whatever. That's the thing. So you don't know what's going on, but I think the Star endorsed John Tory, which probably 10 years ago would have seemed unthinkable. But the Rob Ford factor is part of everything underlining this election, and for not just for newspapers, but for obviously lots of voters who normally would have been sympathetic to Olivia and her message. Right. There was the factor that we do not want Ford in office for another 4 years, and there was a lot of obviously strategic voting. I'm not saying any of the newspapers were being strategic voting when they did endorsements, but that's part of the conversation that happened.
And people, speaking of why the papers did it, because I was very curious that the Star did it, and I actually had a meeting at the Star the week before with people I won't get into where that threw me for a loop. Right. I was surprised that they endorsed Mr. Tory, but then it was explained to me on a walk out of the building, people like being associated with a winner. They don't want to be associated with somebody that all the tea leaves suggest aren't going to. Is that right, wrong, or too hard to say?
To me, that's a little. I don't know if cynical is the right word, but that's kind of. I don't think so. I mean, I think the other thing that people might not realize is that major candidates often go to a newspaper or a news outlet and do like an editorial board. They do a sit-down interview. Yep. Often at the Star, lots of people, there might be 10 or 15 people in the room all waiting to get their question. And how the candidate does often will help inform the paper and their decision.
Is that right? Because I would have figured that was a formality, but it's very interesting.
I don't think so.
Because I can see that being the case, especially with these three candidates. Yeah. You could see which of those three would go into a room of 10, 15 people and leave them going, you know what, that's the right choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just their answers that they provide and the general feeling. Does this seem like a person who's ready to be mayor of a city that's gone through 4 traumatic years and is facing a host of challenges? I'm not going to try and get inside our editorial writers' brains, but I think that does have an impact. And I heard, I was at some of them, not all of them. I heard some of the feedback afterwards, and sometimes I don't get some surprise at how some candidates did, both positive and in some cases negative. And I have to think if it's like, okay, this or this. So as far as just like the Star has made lots of choices that are unpopular, including like criticizing Rob Ford as much as we did in editorials and otherwise. I don't think we were like desperate to be with the winner on this. I think it was just like, here's the person for the various reasons that are laid out that said that we think is the right person to be mayor for the next 4 years.
No, that makes complete sense to me. Ben, I want to go back to what you just said. And if you're writing about this and you don't want to go too far into it, fine. Okay, so because to me, this is a huge issue in this city. I've spent the last 3 weeks giving speeches, meeting people, and this is something that's coming up a lot. And you just said you may write about it, so let's talk about it. But, when you talked about, David, the editorial boards, 10, 15 people, it really was like a job interview. And you can see, and I see this as somebody who was kind of in it, not totally in it, but in it. If you had those 3 people in front of you in a job interview and said, where should the next 4 years of the city be? And, I've said very, very openly and publicly, I like John Tory a lot, decent, competent, caring man, disagree with him on policy, and that's good. We actually respect each other for it. Mm-hmm. But if you had those 3 people in front, it's such a clear choice. It's not even funny. So, Ben, here's where I wanted to go with what you said. There's only one person, and that person's not a fan of mine, and he's not liked by many people, that to me has had sort of the, what's the right word to say this in a PG environment, the courage to say, as much as everybody else is scapegoating everybody but Olivia Chow, her campaign manager, her this, her that, the way she talks, the way she this, only one person who was closely involved in her campaign has said, maybe it's the fact that there's just an unremarkable candidate. And people woke up to the fact that the candidate herself is unremarkable. And I'm going to ask you, I'm setting the question up like this, which is, you do, as you pointed out, and we just talked about it, there were 300,000 or 400,000 people who voted very conservatively in this election. Yet when I went around the city, and we did this for 8-9 months, and you said to people, are you willing to pay a little bit more for services? Do you care about the fact that homeless people are, dirt under our shoe, or that when the police get up to a mentally ill person, they're already thinking confrontation, and the police are the de facto social workers, which they don't want to be. And, if we can spend $1 billion on a police budget, we'll get to the police budget, why can't we spend $1 million on mental health issues? And I find when I go around the city that the city isn't as conservative, as Tea Party, as anti this and anti that as the votes would indicate. So given that you're a paper that is very openly left, to use, I never like those words left and right. They're sort of weird to me, but a paper that's openly left, and the Star is not known as the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch. Is the left dead in this city? Is the left quiet in this city? Does the left not have somebody to put their power behind? What are you seeing?
I don't know that it's dead, but I think what you can say, particularly after this election, is that quite clearly there was no major left-wing candidate in Olivia Chow who she didn't think she could win by saying, I'm going to raise taxes.
Right.
So no one, a major
My
candidate,
crazy move.
Your crazy move. But no mainstream candidate is prepared to do that. And
right.
and that's what, that to be honest, surprised me right off the bat, because as soon as when she said, and she used kind of a bit murky words sometimes, around or whatever. But as soon as you make that pledge, it just means that you can talk a lot about investing in the city and everything, but the money has to come from somewhere, and so your hands are tied to a certain extent. And later on, she did, I think, in response to some criticism, she talked about raising the land transfer tax on the higher value purchases and everything. So she did try to raise taxes and make them more progressive.
$20 million.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not nothing.
No, but wait a minute. In a city with a budget is what, Ben?
A
budget of
$10 billion or something like that.
So we can agree to disagree that $20 million, even though to me $20 million would be I'm gone, retired, and in Chicago with the Ford brothers.
Yeah.
No, I'm joking.
So, Ari, let me ask you a question. Yeah. So did you notice, you traveled around the city, did you notice any difference to increased taxes in the downtown core versus the suburbs? Because I think there is a general feeling that downtown says we would like to pay more. I have a $600,000 house, and I pay $3,800 a year in taxes, maybe $4,000.
Yep.
I could pay more to get better services, but in the suburbs, traditionally, there's an idea that suburban people don't want to pay more.
It's such a great question, Ben. I still want to go back to what we were talking about, but let me answer this, because I think you might have a say on this too, because this is a city, not an enclave answer. We would go around to different parts of the city, and here's an answer. And at one debate, Mr. Tory said, and I say this respectfully because I get what it's like to politic. He would say I would go to the door of people's homes in Scarborough and say, would you be willing to pay an extra buck or two or taxes? And they would say no, because I'm going to be driven out of my house. So the answer to your question, David, is on first blush, the knee-jerk reaction when you'd go to Rexdale, Etobicoke, Scarborough would be to say, no, I don't want to pay more taxes because the Fords have succeeded in this disease that government is bad. We're going to cut government. I'm the right guy to cut government because I stink. Government stinks, and there should be no government. But if you then said to somebody who said, no, I'm against the vehicle registration tax, I'm against tolls, if as a leader you said, can I have 4 or 5 minutes of your time, which you can't do times a million, but this is the pulpit of debates. This is why I actually thought debate should be more factual, more heavily moderated, more evidence-based, more like trials where the moderator, whether it be Steve Paikin, Ben Spurr, David Ryder, calls BS on these subways or free things. But if you would say to these people, let me explain to you what happens to your family when you get rid of a $60 vehicle registration tax. Let me explain to you that if I charge you $2 to get moving on the DVP or a congestion, as soon as you explain it to people, the knee-jerk reaction starts to change, and people are willing to pay more when they really clearly understand they may get more back. The Ford's messaging, the Kuvalis messaging, which you talked about, 10 letters, smart track, gravy train, not coincidence, 10 letters, is brilliant. But to me, the role of a leader, and then I'll end that is my answer, is to say when a senior at the door says, I'm going to be forced out of my house if X, my view, and I don't know that you can do this times a million, is to say, I understand that. Could you make me a cup of tea and I'll come in and I'll explain to you why actually your 50 cents will not only keep you in your house longer, it will pay for the mobility devices that your city is actually cutting back on so that you don't have to go into a crappy long-term care facility, which, by the way, the city is cutting back on. So that's what would happen when we go to the suburbs. You'd get the knee-jerk reaction first. You didn't get that downtown. But as soon as people heard it and you actually spoke to them like grown-ups, I was trying to be the grown-up in the room, people will go, oh, Christ, I never thought of that. That's my answer. Ben?
Well, I don't even know that's a nice picture, but I don't even know if you have to have that much long of a conversation, because if you look at the Scarborough subway decision, that 30-year tax increase, people, that seems to be a fairly popular decision among these areas that we supposedly,
right,
are anti-tax or whatever. But and so they seem to be fine with that. But
if they're even aware of it.
Yeah, but is that the messaging from Mayor Ford that it's going to cost you, I can remember, $10? That
no, it's not.
Was not true.
It's just I'll give you a subway.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm saying.
For $1,200 over 30 years.
Right.
Yeah.
$1,200. We did this math.
Yeah,
$41 times 30.
Right.
And if you said that to the person in Rexdale, do you really realize you're paying for a subway, A, that very few people are going to use, and B, that you're never going to use? They'd be, what? And you're like, that's your Ford.
Right. But I think the question is how much of this is perception, that, because obviously Chow had the idea that, she couldn't run and win by saying I'm going to raise taxes. Where that comes from, I'm sure they did lots of analysis of that proposition. But I think it's interesting, it's this how strong is the Ford effect? Has Ford convinced everyone that you can't raise taxes and everything? Or I think what's really interesting is the Scarborough subway decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's this idea that it would be political suicide for any councillor to vote against the Scarborough subway, right? Because the Ford said this,
mm-hmm.
Your residents will rise up and turf you out
right.
of office, right? Paul Ainsley did it. He won by he got 70% of the vote,
right.
or something like that, right? So I wonder how much of it is perception and this, everyone is just convinced that you can't touch these issues. Or Ford has just convinced people of that, and it's not actually true.
So let me ask you both this, because last week we had Matt Elliott on, and he had just come back from New York City, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned in New York City. So you talked about, Ben, internal polling that you couldn't, Ms. Chow couldn't talk about raising taxes, couldn't talk about this. My view, and there's no way to be proven right, no way to be proven wrong, that if Bill de Blasio, who is the mayor of New York City, openly progressive, openly raising taxes, openly saying people can afford to pay more, if he would have obtained dual citizenship in a very fast-track way, substituted in for Ms. Chow with his profile, and ran on the very things that you just talked about, Ben, taxes, the things we've talked about, I'm not so sure the result would have been the same. To me, a lot of it had to do with the candidate, but you find such a resistance to a discussion about that. Now, we interrupted you a few minutes ago. Is that something that you're writing about, or is it something? What can people look forward to you writing about?
Oh, I just think I'm just interested in the idea of, that there is a perception that Toronto is a progressive city,
Right.
and we keep electing very conservative people a lot of the time, it seems like, and especially I think in the wake of the the provincial NDP had a really tough time in the last provincial election, and I just think it's an interesting question. Like, does the left, clearly has a lot of work to do
Right.
to recapture some hearts and minds, and I don't know how they do that necessarily.
Yeah, but Ari, when you say is the NDP dead or is it left? Like, I always think in politics, like, things can change very quickly. Think of 1993 election where the Conservatives were reduced to 2 seats or something, and everybody's like, "Oh, that's it. The Conservative Party is dead." It was dead for a while. Then there was Reform. Then there was Alliance, and now now we're on a second term of a Conservative government and a majority. So I think if obviously there's lessons to be learned in the provincial election. There's lessons for Olivia Chow. Part of that is how to talk about taxes in a way that people will understand that they have to pay taxes to get a lot of the things they want. But I think you could see a resurgence within 5 or 10 years. I think,
and
that's
I think
possible.
less. I think it's you never know what's going to happen. It's the right figure. It's the right charisma. It's the right person at the right time. You hit the right. You get the right 10-letter slogan.
Right.
Boy, I wish I had a 10-letter slogan.
Yes.
Ben, let's talk for a second. And David, I'm sure this is something that hasn't escaped your attention. The police budget.
Mm-hmm.
And, I saw you sending some stuff out the other day about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know if it was you or perhaps one of your colleagues that said, this is a big win for Mr. Tory. So I guess it's a two-part question. One, where do you think that came from? Where do you think that emanated from, that desire to freeze or flatline the budget? Because that's a very different opening salvo in our negotiation. That's part one. Go ahead.
Well, I just published a story about this moments before I came here, so you probably didn't.
I was driving here in our notorious traffic, so I haven't read it yet.
You don't read
while
well.
you're driving?
No, I don't. And I don't have a driver,
be mayor.
and I don't have a navigator or an Escalade. Maybe one day.
But yeah, actually, a closer look at that report, the kind of the initial headlines about it were that Blair was proposing a 0% increase to the budget, and that he was reducing the size of the force. Yeah. But if you actually look at what is being proposed there, he's proposing a 0% increase to the part of the budget that he has control of, which is not the salary part. It's 11%.
You're kidding me.
Yeah.
Hold on. Let's back this up for people listening, because this is news to me, because
Yeah.
this is like my passion issue. So
Yeah.
for people who are listening, because I want actually people to understand what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
of the police budget, so just say out loud how big the budget is.
Geez.
Roughly
the
budget.
budget.
$1 billion.
It sounds better when it's coming from you, not
yeah,
me.
it's close to a $1 billion gross budget.
All right,
but the
and
net
just so
budget's
for people
smaller.
listening, why what Ben has said matters so much that you actually, because I didn't know this. I've been driving. I was in Brampton today, Etobicoke here. The percentage of the budget that Bill Blair is actually talking about is what percentage of that?
11%, because of the fact
89% is salaries,
salaries.
wages, and benefits.
Yeah.
So for people understanding, that is a massively different story
Yeah.
than the one that I thought I read in your respective papers.
Right. So that's one part of it. The other part is that he's recommending reducing the size of the what's called the approved deployed complement.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the number of officers that the council and the police board have authorized the force to have. But that number is I think something right now it's like 5,500 or something. But for the last couple of years, the actual deployed complement has been 5,275, and he's asking for exactly that same amount of number this year as it was last year, as it was the year before. So he's actually reducing the kind of theoretical number as opposed to the actual hard number.
Right. This is surprising to me to hear. I'm smiling. I mean, if you're listening to this, I'm smiling. I thought it was about the 100% police budget, and now we're taking 100 minus 89.
Right.
Wow.
So the background to this, and it's not it's not devious, I don't think, on Blair's part.
No.
They're going into contract negotiations. The contract expires at the end of the year. He doesn't have any control over it. So I think really, whether it's coincidence or not that this report is coming out right as negotiations start, the message that I think the chief has sent is that I'm doing my part to keep costs low, and now it's up to the police board and the police union who negotiate the contract. It's you guys have to come up with a way to keep costs down.
Okay, that makes sense. David, anything to add? Because we can move on. I didn't know that. My mind is still...
No, it's funny. I hadn't thought it through. Of course, when I think about it, of course, Chief Blair can't wave a magic wand and say no pay rise for all you officers. But yeah, I mean, obviously that's a big issue that I don't think anybody, including I don't think Mr. Tory has figured out how to crack, is that the rising increase in police salaries across the province, and often decided by an arbitrator, and often where you get a piggyback effect where the OPP gets a certain level, so then people say, well, we get at least the same as them.
We get
and then
bumped up.
Yeah, and it is a massive amount of money.
Yeah, and I've talked about this in previous shows, so I won't do it again, where the OPP in many jurisdictions or many municipalities throughout Ontario are realizing that their police budget is providing or keeping a stranglehold, an albatross around their neck where they can't fund their other services. And I worry that we're getting to that point in Toronto because there's so many things in Toronto. Whether you're a bleeding lefty or an arch conservative righty, I don't know if that's what it's called, whatever, it doesn't matter. But everybody agrees in a city of 2.5, 3 million people, hundreds of thousands of new people a year, there are services that we need that actually make us money back. When you start cutting those services because you have to pay a complement of 89%, and by the way, retention pay. Anybody who wants to know how wacky these numbers are, we pay hundreds of millions and tens of millions of dollars to retain police so they don't go somewhere else. Well, you look at most people who want to be police officers, they really want to be a police officer in Toronto, Canada. It's just that 89% number is very surprising. And when I saw it defined as a win for Mr. Tory, I thought to myself, I want the guy to win. I wish him the best, but I'm like, I don't think this was... Right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent. Suppose I've seen some reporters say that Tory has been talking to the police chief and whatever. So I don't know to what extent he's had a hand in this. But I honestly, it looks there's just as a result of more people talking about this and the police board kind of taking a harder line. I think there is. Yeah. Quite a lot of pressure right now on the police. I spoke to Mike McCormick, the police union president, a little while ago, and there's just been a lot of attention to the police around not just policing costs, but also the conduct of police around carding, around mental health issues and police shootings and everything. There's a lot of pressure, and I think this is kind of a moment where the message is starting to resonate that we need to rethink what's going on with the police. So I think Blair's report, again, intentionally or not, is following along those lines.
It's a great conversation.
Setting a new tone, at least.
But just add just one thing quickly is that, I mean, one substantive thing that could change is a lot as far as police salaries is that I know Doug Holliday, when he was a city councillor, and others have complained that the arbitrated agreements, that the arbitrator takes a bunch of factors into account, none of which apparently is the municipality's ability to pay.
Right.
And that's something that Kathleen Wynne, as premier, if she wanted to, could certainly make some changes that could have some real impact.
And you know what, David, just to tie in, and then we'll wrap the police issue up, I get so tired and frustrated by people, saying that, the police budget, we have no control over. We can't do anything about it. It's defined by God herself upstairs. I'm like, come on. When you have one counselor and a council, one counselor asking a question about a police budget, Houston, we have a problem. This is something that if council was ever to get their knickers in a bunch, it should be over that, not over whether we cut down a tree in South Etobicoke that really should be in some small committee. I know many friends who got cut at CBC, they're getting cut at CP24, they're getting cut at CTV. These are people who really have a passion to write, inform. Their dream job is to be the Sunday New York Times, Nick Kristof, that kind of person. Do you guys feel these pressures? Because you're in two very different kinds of publications. Is this a worry in your field where you're constantly looking over your shoulder? Again, because we have a Kardashian sensationalism world, whereas as you're writing a column, and if it's not about the Fords, is this something that goes through your minds, or are you guys so set that, because to me, my friends in this business, they're constantly worried.
I'll just say, I think...
Or are you pleading the fifth?
No, I'm happy. I did a fellowship at Massey College at U of T, and pretty much it was with 5 other journalists, and we brought other journalists in, and pretty much all we talked about was the state of the media and how are we going to get out of this mess. And it's a complicated question, but for newspapers, basically the old model, which was the more readers you had, the more you could pay for big display ads, and the more big buckets of profit you made, is broken. Advertisers have all kinds of opportunities, some of which, like YouTube videos, can cost very little, and while the Star, I'm happy to say, is still profitable, I mean, everybody knows that there's pressures on the newspaper ads, which primarily are our main driver. So I think everybody, I'm worried. I've been doing it for long enough that maybe I'll make it to retirement without having the feeling the impact personally. But I have lots of friends who are journalists just starting out, and I've gone to speak to journalism classes, and of course the question is like, should I do this? And it's a hard thing because I always say like, where I'm coming from an environment when I started where you knew exactly how things worked, and it was always tough to get a job in journalism. There was always more people who wanted to do it than there were jobs. But if you were good and you were willing to go somewhere, I went to Brandon, Manitoba. You could fight your way back to a big city if that's what you wanted to do. And then we're kind of in the middle of a tube or a tunnel. And I say, we don't really know what's at the other end. I think there is going to be something. And it's going to fund investigative journalism, I hope, whether it's going to be some kind of a university model or a nonprofit or whatever. But I think there will be a future for journalism because there always will be a demand and a need. But right now, it's hard because we're in this dark tunnel and we just don't know what's at the other end.
And you look at who's breaking stories. It's often people who aren't at the Star, and the Star will, there's a recent one that's broken by somebody else, and it's coming up, and there's entrepreneurs in the States who are actually funding investigative journalism things. There's Vice, that's a bigger conglomerate, but there's sort of people behind the scenes saying, we want to be somebody who goes to rake the muck, to use the term. Ben, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a stressful time for a lot of journalists, and as David says, I mean, the old model is broken, and that causes concern. I do believe that journalism there is too much of a demand for it from the public, and I think everyone benefits from good journalism, and so I think it will stick around in one form or another. And as you say, I think as much as the old model doesn't work anymore, there are some interesting. There's sometimes the kind of cream rises to the top to some extent, right? You have people who are kind of doing DIY kind of journalism who end up making immense contributions. Jesse Brown being one of them.
That's who I was referring to.
But Matt Elliott before him was doing excellent blogging work, and thankfully someone major picked him up and stuff. So I think it's encouraging that you can kind of make a non-traditional way for yourself if you have the talent and stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, Jonathan Goldsby parlayed Twitter into a marquee columnist job in a large, respected publication in the biggest media market in Canada. That's huge.
Yeah, and what I noticed about you guys, and then two quick questions in the 3 minutes we have left, it seems like you guys are always working. That's what I like. Like, wherever you go, you're part of it. You're there.
I'm glad I give off that impression.
Well, I think you do. I mean, unless you're fooling me, but I'm a tough guy to fool. But it's these are people in the mix. So two very quick questions before we wrap up. The TTC union report. We talked about that at the beginning. The TTC union was quite right to say, look, we need more funding from the feds. I get that. That's not a complicated argument to make. But did it very much play into the new mayoralty hands, which is like, we're not asking Torontonians to pay any more. And I've said before, and this is what I want you to comment on, factoring in that TTC union thing, I just have trouble understanding how you go to the feds or the province, unless you're best friends with Kathleen Wynne, which this is a very bizarre situation where it appears that there are best friends, without the federal and provincial government saying, hello, we gave you this thing called the City of Toronto Revenue Act that has 7 revenue tools that are available for you to actually show X, Y, or Z, but you keep saying no to them. What are you guys' views on the inside about how you negotiate that, or whether this makes sense in a city that has that act and perpetually and continually chooses not to use it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that John Tory is going to get a different answer than anyone else who's asking for more money from other levels of government. But
he demands it. He says he's going to shame them, and I'm like, well, I didn't know that's a negotiating tactic.
David Miller certainly tried. I mean, he had his gas tax crusade that had no discernible impact.
Right, and this is what I worry about. You have the TTC union that I think should be, it's very smart. The paper, I read it. I'm like, is anybody going to talk about the fact that maybe we have to start at home first, as unpopular as certain things are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. You make
Tough
a good
question.
point. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, the
No,
the
fine.
money has to come.
I like having a stumper. I like to see Doug Ford answer that one. Last question. This is meant to be more of a fun question before we wrap up. 1 minute left, 30 seconds each night. I love that you guys were here. You guys have families, friends. You're always out and about. I saw you at Queen's Park giving a talk. You're always out and about at these things. When you're not on the clock, what are the things that people keep asking you about over and over that if you had $1 for every time somebody asked me X, you wouldn't need to go to work tomorrow? I'm imagining you guys have been asked some really funny, weird questions in the last year. What jumps to the top of your mind?
Well, for the last 4 years, any time I see my family from out of town, is, oh, hey, how's Rob Ford treating you right now? And now it's all, oh, I bet you're not very busy anymore.
Right. That's the question.
I mean,
David?
Rob Ford and Doug Ford, like the number of times where I've been at a family event or a local potluck in the neighborhood, and I mean, people always want the inside. I think there was always an idea that, that's what I'm reading, but what's the real story?
Yeah, what does the tape really show? How old is she?
Is there another?
How old is she?
Yeah, there are all those things. But I laugh. I mean, when I was on this fellowship, I was lucky enough to go to Berlin.
Yeah.
I open up. I read kind of basic German. I open up the paper, and there's Krackrauchen Bürgermeister.
Right.
I'm like, oh, I know what this is about.
Right.
You know, I'm like, Rob Ford. And German MPs would ask us about that. So that was, for the last 4 years, that's been the major
I thought
question.
that was going to be. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very
Ben,
much.
thank you so much. I look forward to reading what you were just talking about. David,
My pleasure.
thank you. We're going to switch. We're going to have Camille come in and talk about animal rights for a crazy case that I went to a speech to, that if you film something undercover in an agricultural farm in the States, or all the horrible practices for animals where, they're beating them and they're killing them and leaving them on the ground, the person taking the video gets arrested. So we're going to have a quick chat about that.
Yikes.
These are the things that make me go, come on. Camille, I went to a talk the other day, and then I'm going to want you to fill in the rest and take over, where a gentleman named Justin from the States was presenting a discussion about all these things. And, people listening at home or at work will know Dateline NBC and all these 60 Minutes behind the scenes where you see this horrible, gruesome footage that's obtained by humane societies or Mercy for Animals. And now the dairy farmers and the agricultural farmers and that lobby have brought laws that if you videotape animals being beaten, tortured, abused on the way to their inevitable death so that we can eat, the person taking the video is going to jail, not the producer. I thought that's the most insane pile of absolute horsemanure garbage I had ever seen, and I said, Camille, you have to come on The Truth with Ari Goldkind and talk to us about this. Camille, what do you do for a living? Why is this your passion? What's on the agenda?
Well, like you were saying, you can't make this up. It couldn't be crazier if I'd manufactured it. I'm an animal rights lawyer, and, I call myself that, but it's a bit of a misnomer because animals don't have many legal rights under the law. So what animal advocates have to do is get creative and find ways to show people what actually happens to animals in situations like factory farms, like zoos, like aquariums, like rodeos, and the entertainment industry. One really effective way of doing this is actually going undercover into these facilities and videotaping simply what people see. So a model that's worked quite well in the United States, particularly by groups like Mercy for Animals, PETA, the Humane Society of the United States, they actually have people who get hired on at places like factory farms, dairy farms, slaughterhouses, beef farms, chicken facilities. And these individuals simply go to work every day. They wear hidden cameras, and they film what they see. And when this footage comes out and hits shows like Dateline, all the 10 p.m. news shows in the States, and now here in Canada over the last couple of years, people are rightly horrified. The abuse and neglect that we see, the open festering wounds, the beatings of animals, it's universally horrible. And every time these organizations go undercover, they see the same things. So what's happened recently in the States, and what Mr. Justin Marceau was speaking to us about last week, actually earlier this week on Monday at the University of Toronto, he was talking about something that we call ag-gag laws.
Can you say that again? Ag-gag laws.
Ag-gag.
Like it is as it sounds, to gag. I just want people
Egg.
to listen.
Egg.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
That's right. This was actually a term that was coined by Mark Bittman, who's a New York Times food writer. Some of you
Great
might.
food writer. Great
Great
cookbook.
food writer. Yeah, exactly. He's written a wonderful vegetarian one, too.
But I digress.
Mark Bittman came up with this term, and it really stuck because it kind of encapsulates what's going on here. The industry and certain states are trying to gag those people who would expose abuse in the egg industry. And what they're saying now, in places like Idaho and Utah, which have passed pretty strong anti-filming undercover laws, what they're saying is that if you go undercover into a facility, you risk being prosecuted for doing a number of things, like lying on an application to get a job there, like using a recording device inside the facility, and publicizing what you see. Now, what's really encouraging is that Justin Marceau, who came to speak to us, is a law professor, brilliant guy, and he's kind of heading up a team of groups and individuals who are launching a pretty robust legal challenge to these types of laws. And they've had some good victories along the way, but they're not quite at the final stages yet. So everyone's hopeful that the courts will say, "Nah, you can't do this."
So let's go into it for a minute, because I went to that speech and I asked Justin some questions after, and if we have time, we have a few minutes, I'll get into those questions and answers. But why does this, besides the obvious, if you're an animal lover, you don't have to be a vegetarian to be an animal lover. So I want
That's for sure.
That's for sure. But why does this matter so much? And why should this matter to everybody, not just people who would be sort of bleeding heart cat ladies, dog people? I mean, I'm a dog person. Why should this matter to the average person listening who may be like, well, there are humans suffering too. Why don't you get all worked up over that? Tell us why.
The reason it matters is, well, there's people like you love your dog. I love animals. Lots of people love animals. Even those of us who aren't really serious about caring for animals still recognize and feel a little bit queasy when somebody abuses them, because we recognize that just like us, just like our cats, just like our dogs, they have the capacity to feel pain, they can feel fear, they can suffer, and they can also feel pleasure and enjoy relationships with other animals.
Which is proven. It's not a theory. This is
that's
proven.
hard science.
You look at elephants, you look at any research on this. Right, so go on, sorry.
Sure, there's no doubt about that anymore. So the reason it should matter to everyone is that in Canada alone, and I'm not even going to get into the billions of animals used in the States, but in Canada alone, over 700 million animals are used and killed in the factory farming system for food. And if we're going to be using those animals, we have a responsibility and an obligation to treat them in a way so that they don't experience suffering. And that's not the reality right now for those animals.
And so can these barbaric practices, and by the way, if you're a person who doesn't think this is important or it doesn't strike a nerve as you're listening to this, try and watch the footage. Try and watch the footage that's online or on YouTube about what's being done to these animals, because you're yourself probably going to turn away. It will be too hard, too gruesome, and too heartbreaking to watch. And if it's not, well, my sense is you're on your way to, I'm going to make a Magnata joke, but I don't think anybody would get it. But it's true. I mean, you really have to have a dark, evil, I don't care what people think. You have to have a dark, evil thought if you don't think that there should be humanity. I mean, that's a weird word when you talk about humans doing this, but to have animals treated humanely on their way to transport to death, and being killed so that we can eat them. And that's a whole different environmental conversation. But the people who don't understand, you watch this footage that you yourself feel very passionate about, it's almost unwatchable.
It is. Many people simply have to turn away. In fact, CTV has now aired, I believe, 4 investigations into factory farms, egg farms, dairy farms, pig farms. We get emails all the time, my group does, other groups do, from people who say, wow, I caught a few minutes and I just couldn't bear to watch the rest. I had to turn it off. They feel so strongly because they understand intuitively that those animals are suffering.
And do you think there's credence to the idea, and I just said this a second ago, and I don't personally, that, some people would say, well, why don't you just worry about all the human suffering first, all the children suffering first, and, animals can come second. That's not a persuasive argument to me, because that's like saying, shouldn't somebody with breast cancer come before somebody with prostate cancer, vice versa? That's just a stupid argument. How do you respond to that in a more intelligent way than I just did? Because I just think it's stupid.
Well, I think the great thing about compassion is that the more that you have, the more you have to spread around. And
Okay, that was a much better answer.
there you go.
That was a much okay. That was
Being
a
nice
much
to animals
better answer.
is consistent
No,
with,
that was a
with
much
taking care of
better
people.
answer, and it says something about you, not the animal, when you can feel compassion. What if somebody were to say? Because I go through the other side of it, and I'll get to the question I asked Justin. With the producers, or the idiot torturers, would they say, well, if we don't do this, it's going to make your burger $4 from the $2 it is now. It's going to make your steak at the keg, $38 versus the $26 now. Is there an economic argument for why these practices need to continue?
Well, you're right, Ari. Producers say that every single time. They say we can't possibly treat animals better because you'd have to pay for it. But guess what? In the European Union, they do treat animals better. They have stronger laws, and animals don't suffer to the same extent they do here in Canada. And the factory farming business and the farming business have not gone out of business. And the other thing is that people, when surveyed, consistently say they're happy to pay a little bit more for food that hasn't been abused first.
Right. And we find that more and more and more. There's an appetite from people, even people who are not whole food shoppers. This is important because, you go to Whole Foods, and I go to Whole Foods, I'm like, Jesus, you have to win the lottery to shop in here. This is something that if you go door to door and again, I talked about this in the previous segment, you explain to people, maybe it's an extra cent or two, not $5. And it's also a question of what world do we want to live in? Isn't that a conversation you think we should be having of what do we want to be surrounded by? What kind of people? What kind of life? What kind of energy? What do you think about that?
Yeah, people are willing to put their money where their mouths are. They're happy to pay more for products that aren't filled to the same degree with suffering. And other people are happy to start cutting some of those products out of their diets completely.
So something I asked Justin, and we have 2 minutes left, so let me get to this, is, I'm a criminal lawyer. I talk about it all the time, and I think like the devil's advocate. What is the best argument on the other side? The other side, you're the lawyer on the side, Justin's the lawyer on the good side, and I say happily the good side. Is there a great, clever argument that the bad side has as to, why this stupid law, this ag-gag law should take place? Is there a brilliant argument that even you're like, oh, geez, that's a good one?
Well, I've read their court documents, and I haven't seen them making any brilliant arguments. I suspect if there were any, they'd be saying them.
All right. So in the few seconds we have left, for people who are really interested in what you're talking about, give a plug for where people can read more about this, find out more about you, read more about your plans, and maybe even look at the footage that we're saying is a wake-up call. Where can people go?
Absolutely. I'm the director of legal advocacy with a group called Animal Justice Canada. We're the country's only animal law charity, and you can visit us at www.animaljustice.ca to find out more.
How do you get more people, besides going to the website? What is the plan? Because everything has to be about profile, branding, amassing consensus. What's the plan to get more and more people aware of this and more people concerned about it?
Well, we do public outreach all the time. I'm encouraged about the future. Every time I go to a law school, I meet 5 or 10 law students who say, I just want to be an animal rights lawyer. And to me, that bodes really well. So I think you're going to see this field become pretty big in the years to come.
Who pays? who pays the bill?
Animals don't have much money, as I'm finding out.
Well, is it something that people can make a living at?
So far, so good. I've started my own practice within the last 4 or 5 months, and so far I'm feeding myself fine.
Well, I love that you're doing this. Just looking at what you were doing made me say, I have to have you come on here and talk about this. This is something that I hope people listening really take an interest in. The world should be moving more in this way, whether it be our oceans, whether it be factory farming, fish farming, which is going on in BC. This is something that really is a measure of, and people know listening, how you treat your animal or how the world treats animals. I think this is Gandhi, sort of reflects, who we are as a society. So, Camille, anywhere else people can look you up or find anything about you if they wanted to?
Labchuklaw.ca is my firm website.
Good, because you're one of the few lawyers, myself as one of them, that I want more business to come to rather than less. The world has lots of lawyers, and I really hope people can check this out. This has been The Truth with Ari Goldkind. Thank you, everybody, for listening live. If you're listening live, and if you downloaded this, or you're watching on YouTube once we put this on YouTube, I thank you so much for listening, as always, and we will talk to you next week. Thank you, Camille. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Ari.